Dividing fractions by fractions can get tricky. We're going to look at two different methods for dividing a fraction by a fraction. The first method is to take your two fractions, so a over b divided by c over d, and line them up horizontally and simply divide across. And so we would divide the numerators, a divided by c in the numerator, and we would divide our denominators, b divided by d in the denominator. So let's look at this with some real numbers. If we had two fractions, 6/10 divided by 2/5, we can see that 6 is divisible by 2 and 10 is divisible by 5. So we can use this method for this particular problem. And we can simply divide across numerator by numerator, denominator by denominator, and find our answer. So in the numerator, we would just look at 6 divided by 2. In our denominator, we would calculate 10 divided by 5, and we would end up then with 6 divided by 2 equals 3, and 10 divided by 5 equals 2. So our answer to 6/10 divided by 2/5 is 3/2. And this technique only works if both the numerator and the denominator can divide into whole number quotients. This 6 divided by 2 the answer has to be a whole number, and your denominator, 10 divided by 5, your answer has to be a whole number. For most fractions, this is not true, and so for those trickier problems, we use the invert and multiply method. Let's take a look at the invert and multiply method. So first of all, looking at fractions, to invert a fraction means to switch the numerator with the denominator. So if I have a fraction a over b, for example, and I am going to invert this fraction, I will end up flipping it over, and what's in my denominator gets flipped up to my numerator, and what's in my numerator gets flipped down into my denominator. Now, this is really important because when we're dividing fractions by fractions, we're going to use this method a lot of inverting our second fraction. So let's look, for example, first of all, at a number b, for example. So to divide by a number b is the same as multiplying by the inverse of that number, or 1 over b. So if I have a number, and you can imagine a little imaginary 1 under any number. If I have a number b, and I'm going to divide by b, it is the same as multiplying by its inverse, or multiplying by 1 over b. And we'll look at some examples of this. So another way to say it too is if I have, for example, a divided by b, this is the same as, equal to, a times the inverse of b, which is 1 over b. Let's look at it with some actual numbers. So if I have 4 divided by 8, for example, this is the same as, this is equivalent to 4 times the inverse of 8 is 1 over 8. So 4 divided by 8 is the same as 4 times 1 over 8, which we can see it this way too, 4 divided by 8, or 4/8, 4 times 1 over 8. Let's look at an example of dividing a fraction by a fraction. So here we have a over b, our dividend, divided by c over d, our divisor. So with the invert and multiply method, what you want to do is you take your divisor method, or your divisor fraction, and you invert it. In other words, you take this second fraction and you flip it over. And then you change the operation of division to multiplication. So what you'll end up doing is you keep your first fraction the same, your a over b, and then you take your second fraction and flip it over to make it d over c. So I inverted my second fraction from c over d, I inverted it to d over c. And I changed this operation from division to multiplication. So a over b divided by c over d becomes a over b times d over c. And we'll use this method to solve our problem. Let's look at an example using real numbers. So if I am asked to have 2/3 divided by 3/4, what I want to do is I want to take my divisor fraction, my second fraction, and invert it. So I'm going to flip it over. So my second fraction becomes 4/3, the inverse of 3/4. I change my operation from division to multiplication. So that becomes multiply. And I keep my first fraction, or my dividend, the same. So 2/3. And now I just work this out like a multiplication of fractions problem. I multiply numerator by numerator and denominator by denominator. So 2 times 4 on top here, 2 times 4, and in my denominator 3 times 3, and I end up with the answer of 8/9, or 8/9. Now I could see when I was first given the problem that I cannot divide 2 by 3 and get a whole number, and I cannot divide 3 by 4 to get a whole number. So I have to use this invert and multiply method in this given problem. So my answer to my problem, 2/3 divided by 3/4, equals 8/9.